Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who have joined us in the past Tahrir dialogues, and they've been many. This is the 102nd Tahrir dialogue that I've hosted. I'm the Dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo, and it's a tremendous pleasure to host these dialogues because they are always about important events with distinguished speakers and participants on issues that we believe are important for the common good. It's really one of the achievements that the university and the school are quite proud of. Today's dialogue is consistent with our goals and our and the content that we focus on, as well as, of course, the distinguished participants. What we're doing this evening is a discussion of a recently published book. The book is called Reaching for Heights, the inside story of a secret attempt to reach a Syrian-Israeli peace by Ambassador Frederic Hoff. And we have Ambassador Hoff with us this evening. Ambassador Hoff has been a public servant for over 3 decades. He's served in the military, he's served as a diplomat, he's served in the think tank community talking about policy issues, and he's now an academic. So in many ways, except for the think tank part of it, we've done a lot of the same things, but in different countries. He's also been the special envoy on Syria, 2009, 2011, if I'm not mistaken, but has been associated with the Syrian file and consequently what's happening in the Middle East for a number of years in different hats. So he brings quite a lot to the table. And when you read the book, you'll really be challenged because it has a tremendous amount of detail, but it also has analysis and, if you want, some anecdotes. So there is some personal effect in there. It's a serious book that you need to read carefully, but it's definitely a book that's attractive to read at the same time. So I congratulate Ambassador Hoff for having done that. Ambassador Hoff will speak for a couple of minutes, and then we will then have a discussion. The discussion will be led by Ambassador Ramzi Ramzi. Ambassador Ramzi Ramzi is a former Egyptian diplomat, having served as ambassador both in Germany and in Austria, but he also served as deputy ambassador at the embassy in Washington, and most recently, he was assistant secretary at the UN and deputy special envoy for Syria. So he's had both a front door and back door relationship with the Syrian file as well, and I'm sure he's going to give Ambassador Hoff a hard time. I will join in the discussion as well as we go along. I have not negotiated the Syrian file directly at any point, but I have been associated with the topic, having been a diplomat myself, and the Syrian file never leaves the Middle East conflict debate. So I do have some questions and some comments. Let me, before starting us off, emphasize a couple of points. We will first start with the presentation, then the discussion. Anybody who wants to send in questions, please do so on the chat. I will try to accommodate as many as I can after 1 or 2 rounds of discussions between the author and the two of us. Note also that this is a recorded session. It's both public and recorded. So I encourage you to be candid and straightforward, but at the same time, let's try to keep the questions and comments as concise as we can to give a chance to as many people as we can. We have audience both from the Middle East, where Ramzi and I are presently, but also from North America and around the world. So this, I think, will be quite an interesting and engaging session. If I'm not mistaken, and staff, please correct me if I am, I think there's also translation into Arabic for this session. So we will be speaking in English, one, because the author is an English speaking, but also because the university is an English language university. So we'll start off by speaking in English, but I sense that there's also Arabic translation for those who want. And if you want to send in your questions in Arabic, I have the capacity to understand them and I will put them forward in English. Let's start by Ambassador Hoff and give you a chance to share some of your thoughts. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Nabil, thank you very, very much. It is a great honor to be with you and with Ambassador Ramzi, and indeed to take part in this event of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I thank you for giving me the time to interact with you and with all of your guests. This is a book about the experience I had, an experience that lasted the better part of 2 years, from the spring of 2009 until the spring of 2011, trying to negotiate, mediate peace between Syria and Israel. Now, with the passage of nearly a dozen years, and after we've seen what's happened within Syria, a situation that Ambassador Ramzi is intimately familiar with, it seems like an incredible undertaking. It seems like perhaps some people might be inclined to believe it was a fool's errand. The idea of trying to mediate peace between these two countries, but it was a very serious effort. I wrote the book because, number one, I thought there was a very interesting story to tell, story about the key characters, a story about the process, a story of what it was like to work in the U.S. State Department at the time, trying to achieve a very important goal. It's a story that has been untold over the past decade, 12 years, and I think for me the most important aspect of it was trying to fill in a historical gap. The United States, on and off, has been seriously engaged in trying to mediate peace between Israel and Syria, basically since 1993, when Bill Clinton became president in January of that year. And he came into office with the idea that he could do something to broaden Arab-Israeli peace beyond Israel-Egypt, Jordan, Israel. His first priority was Syria-Israel peace. So this book is an attempt to fill this gap, to tell the story of what, for all we know, may have been the final U.S. attempt to mediate peace between these two countries. For me personally, these 2 years were, I must say, the highlight of my professional career. Even though the effort in the end failed because of the decision of President Bashar al-Assad of Syria, essentially to wage war on his own people. Even though it failed, in a sense, I was living a dream. At the age of 16, as a high school student, I signed up for an exchange program called American Field Service, AFS. It used to be a big, famous program in the United States. And I received a letter one day telling me I'd be going to Damascus, Syria, during the summer in between my junior and senior year of high school. And I would be living with a Syrian family And it was at that time, it was in the context of that exchange student experience, that I had the idea for the first time that someday, perhaps somehow in my professional career, I could be involved in an attempt to make peace between Syria and Israel, and to help create a situation where there could be an official relationship of warmth and friendship between Syria and the United States. So for 2 years, I made the effort. For the first half of the experience, there were times where I felt I was simply going in circles, diplomatically speaking. There was a breakthrough of sorts when Senator John Kerry, who was then the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, had a key meeting with President Bashar al-Assad and his foreign minister, Walid al-Mu'allim, in which the Syrian side put in writing its willingness to consider a peace arrangement with Israel, whereby in exchange for the full return of Syrian territory lost during the June 1967 war, Syria would realign its relationships within the region so as to neutralize any threats to the state of Israel arising from those relationships. So we're talking about Syria's relationship with Iran, Syria's relationship with Hezbollah. The Kerry letter didn't spell out specific countries, but the meaning was clear. And based on that letter, and with the assistance of a key National Security Council staffer in the White House, Dennis Ross, I was able to undertake direct talks with Prime Minister Netanyahu, in which the Israeli side and then the Syrian side agreed that the way we would proceed would be for the American side to draft a treaty of peace, to put something in writing on the table, and then to use this draft to go back and forth between Damascus and Jerusalem in an attempt to come up with a document that both sides could agree to all the way to the final punctuation mark. And this is the process we were involved in. I had a key one-on-one meeting with President Bashar al-Assad on the 28th of February, 2011, in which, among other things, he agreed very specifically, very explicitly, that military relationships posing threats to Israel would in fact be dissolved in return for a treaty of peace that would return to Syria over time all of the territory that was lost in June 1967. There was a lot of work done on both sides, mainly by me, in trying to get both sides to agree to the exact extent of the territory we were talking about. And we got to the point in March of 2011 where the only territorial issue outstanding between the parties had to do with the upper course of the Jordan River, flowing into Lake Tiberias. All other territorial elements were essentially settled. There was still detailed work to be done, but after meetings with Assad and then with Netanyahu, on April 2nd or so, 2011. Dennis Ross and I were in a position where we thought our next step would be to bring the parties together for proximity talks in an Eastern European country. We were thinking in terms of either the Czech Republic or Hungary. Then the violence in Syria began. Both Dennis and I, Dennis in particular, urged President Obama, at my recommendation, to reach out to Assad telephonically to warn him that if the violence were to continue, a very promising mediation would go away. The president declined to do so. The violence continued, and the mediation had to stop. We came to the conclusion that the president of Syria no longer possessed the requisite legitimacy to be able to speak for Syrians on matters of war and peace, and there was no inclination on our part to try to continue the process. That in essence is the story. I think I would certainly hope that readers would find the book interesting, not only in terms of the details of the diplomatic effort, but some of the characterizations of the key players in all of this. Certainly, the person to whom I reported, George Mitchell, one of the finest public servants I have ever met. There are sketches of Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Assad, and others that I think readers will find quite interesting. I think I should stop there, and I'm very eager to try to address the tough questions that I'm sure will be thrown my way.
Thank you, Pastor Hoff. Ramzi, would you like to jump in?
Sure. Ambassador Hoff, great to see you again. And I must say, I really enjoyed your book. And I congratulate you on the book for a number of reasons. And I really would also recommend it, not only for those who follow the Middle East, but I think also for those who are interested in international mediation, because it has a lot of detail, a lot of tactics, and a lot of, I would say, procedures that many would benefit from when they undertake very, very complicated mediation efforts, such as the one between Syria and Israel. And I particularly thank you for, I think by the end of the book, you have been very clear and very honest in casting doubt, in spite of everything you have done, as to whether the Israelis or the Syrians will ultimately deliver on the promises they gave you all through the process. And I think that's a very fair point. Now, I have a few questions. Some are general and some are more specific. So I'll start with the more general, and then as we proceed, maybe move to the specific. Now, clearly, as a mediator, you did an excellent job in tackling, I think, the most sensitive issue between Israel and Syria, which is the June 4th, 1967 line. And as you just said, you're almost there. Just maybe a few kilometers here or there, but you're almost there. Only the upper reaches of the Jordan River was still not being resolved, but otherwise everything else was. My question to you here, why do you think whatever you have presented would have been ultimately accepted by both sides, and particularly by the Syrians? And here I would like to draw your attention and see whether you have factored in these 2 points. First, reading your book, I got the impression the Israelis never really committed themselves fully to what was the June 4th line. And particularly Barak presented in Shepherdstown what you call Erat's line. So, and then they leaked the document. So the Syrians were in a difficult situation, as you acknowledge. So why would they trust them? Second, did you factor in the Taba experience between Egypt and Israel, whereby Israel committed itself to withdraw from all Egyptian territory occupied in 1967, and then when the issue of delimitation of borders came up, we were faced with a surprise. So why would the Syrians accept at face value anything on paper before delimitation actually takes place? I mean, usually it's the other, but given the Egyptian experience, why would they accept that until they are, maybe a mediator like yourself would actually do the delimitation first before they accept a deal with the Israelis? The third point is on the issue of deposit. I know you weren't there when the deposit was negotiated, but you worked with the deposit for all through your time. Again, a question here: why would Assad accept one element of the Rabin deposit, which basically says that an agreement between Israel and Syria would not be dependent on progress on other tracks, whereas the Israelis made it very clear that all negotiations are dependent on developments in the region. And if you remember, in Shepherdstown, they broke they suspended the negotiations because of what happened in Lebanon. So why would the Syrians ultimately accept this, I would say, dichotomy? I think I'll stop at that, and then I still have a lot more questions. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Excellent questions. I never got to the point in this mediation, Ramzi, where I could feel absolutely certain that both parties, once an agreed text was reached, that both parties would pull the trigger and move toward a final agreement. As diplomats, we always find ourselves, or normally find ourselves, in a situation where our ability to read the minds of our principal interlocutors is somewhat limited. Okay, I could foresee many opportunities in the future, assuming violence had not consumed Syria. I could still see many opportunities in the future where one party or the other might seize on a detail to exit the process altogether. All I could do as a mediator was to try to build a sense of confidence in me on the part of both sides, and take this step by step by step. Specifically on the June 4th line, I was unable to detect on the Israeli side any tendency to play games with the line in a manner parallel to Ehud Barak, particularly at the Geneva summit with Clinton and Assad in early 2000, I think March 2000. The Israelis were engaging with me. This was a special team designated by Prime Minister Netanyahu a team of people reporting directly to him, and we were deeply engaged in the meter by meter details of where this line was going to run. Certainly, in the future, when we would be obliged to get down to the details of delimitation of a future boundary, certainly there were going to be disputes as we got down to meter to meter. My own sense, Ramzi, of the sequence was that there would be a delimitation before the final document was signed, that the Syrians, that both sides would be absolutely certain about what they were signing up to in a territorial sense. All right. And we anticipated that that the Israeli process of withdrawing from the Golan and from certain areas in the Jordan Valley that had been part of demilitarized zones between 1949 and 1967, that this process would take somewhere between three and 5 years. In terms of the deposit, you're right. For the first half of this effort, I just beat my head against the wall, trying to get the traditional deposit from the Israeli side, trying to explain to Israelis that the deposit was not a preemptive concession of territory to Syria. This is the way it's often characterized in Israeli politics. What the deposit was simply an agreement about what the negotiation would be all about. The negotiation would be over the terms and conditions of Syria retrieving all territory lost in June 1967. Whether there could be agreement on all those terms and conditions, this was a big question mark. This was the nature of my effort. But this deposit had acquired a political meaning in Israeli politics that made it difficult for all Israeli prime ministers, whether Likud or Labor, to sign up for it. And this is why eventually I offered both sides the option of allowing us to put a draft agreement on the table and then shuttling it back and forth. This was agreeable to the Syrian side. In terms of relationships to other tracks, in my experience, what mattered to the United States and I must say to Israel as well during this mediation was what would happen with respect to Lebanon. Assad, in the key discussion I had with him, was silent on the issue of the Palestinian track. All right, and it was not a subject I raised, but I did raise the subject of Lebanon because clearly, the position of Hezbollah and Syria's relationship with Hezbollah, all of this would have a large bearing on Syria's ability to remove threats to the state of Israel in return for the acquisition of territory lost in June 67. Assad made it very clear to me. He said, I've already I've already told Lebanese President Michel Sleiman to prepare his negotiating team. He said, Mr. Hoff, I can assure you that Sayed Hassan Nasrallah is not Persian. He's an Arab. He will go along with all of this. And he said, Mr. Hoff, let me assure you that Iran will go along with all of this. And I must say, I must admit, I felt a strong sense of skepticism about that. I found it very, very difficult to believe that Iran and Hezbollah would simply accede to the loss of Syria and Syria's strategic reorientation within the region. But at the time, I mean, this was the position the president of Syria took. I made clear to him my own sense of skepticism about that, but this was his position, and ultimately, if things had taken a different course, if he decided to proceed to the end game, he would have had to deal with his situation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Hoff, and thank you, Ramzi, for the questions. Let me jump in here with some comments and some, if you want, anecdotes. I've negotiated with the Israelis on different opportunities and negotiated with Syrians, but not in terms of conflict resolution, but in terms of Arab affairs. That either of them would agree to generalities is an assumption that I don't think anybody serious should take. And I say this because I actually found tremendously interesting in your book, and I commend it to people to read, that you try to get into a lot of the details of the negotiations at each phase and to explain what happened and what did not. In reading your book, I have to say, several questions come to my mind. As a former negotiator, our assumption always was that the Israeli-Syrian track was easier than the Palestinian-Israeli track, because it was about territory and traditional national security issues rather than identity, as well as all those issues. I would add here that in the 90s, particularly after the Madrid Peace Conference, the Syrians were quite annoyed with the Palestinians that they had opened up engagement with the Israelis in Oslo or in Madrid. And Farouk al-Shara, the foreign minister at the time, openly said, we will not negotiate separately, but we will not be left out. He said this openly in an Arab meeting as sort of a warning that now that you, in other words, the Palestinians, are negotiating directly, don't expect us to wait. So, yes, neither side was going to commit completely to all the details without driving the other one crazy and driving you crazy and everybody else, but that's beside the point. I just really can't understand why they failed, because some of the questions put were obvious. The Syrians from day one were saying it's June 4th, and anything but June 4th is a non-starter. They told me that personally, and they also told me, frankly, that all the mumbo jumbo about normalization and security guarantees and all of that, that's possible. That's not an issue. Now, for them, it was they wanted June 4th the same way the Egyptians had gotten what we got. They tend to forget that we got the last part of it by law, by a court, but that's beside the point. What surprised me, frankly, is what the Americans did. I mean, to convene the Clinton-Assad summit in Geneva with the assumption that Assad's going to accept anything less than June 4th was, for me, surprising. I literally I contacted Aaron Miller at the time, and I said, I hear you're going to have a meeting in Geneva, and he didn't want to comment. And he didn't deny it, but he didn't comment. So I concluded that there was a meeting. And I also told him what was going to be offered. And I told him openly, this is not going to work. So I have no idea how you guys are assuming this is going to be acceptable. And of course, it didn't work, not because I was a genius, but because this was an obvious situation that the Syrians had been saying openly. I still believe, had the Israelis truly offered June 4th, even after difficult negotiations, they would have gotten the commitment from Syria that we will not be part of anything that threatens Israel. That's in essence what they were saying. And don't forget, at the time, they were very influential in the Levant. Much more influential, much more emphasis than they have now. And let me also add here that I think it was Shepherdstown, if I'm not mistaken, later with Farouk al-Shar actually came to me after the meeting in Shepherdstown and said, you made a statement that we are 85% of the way through the process. How in the world did you get that figure? Because it's exactly correct. All of the rest of this stuff is solvable if we simply get a commitment on territory. That the Syrians, having gone that far repeatedly, and it's not only in the negotiations with the Israelis, they're telling everybody else. I just don't believe that they weren't serious about this. Why wouldn't the Israelis accept this? If it's an easier track to solve, it makes the Palestinian track the focus of more difficult direct negotiations. And if I may say, I commend your effort at the end to draft a complete text. I'm not sure whenever else the Americans actually completed a complete text. So you're to be commended for your commitment and complimented for your naivety to actually do that completely. But I mean, I commend you for that. But seriously, you put forward a complete text. Couldn't you have had more influence on the parties to push them towards the border issue?
Well, you put your, yes.
Can I just throw one last question so I don't ask for the floor again?
Yes.
Because you brought this up. Lebanon. My understanding is there is a Hof boundary or a Hof maritime line. I'm curious, could you shed some more detail on that? Because that's a topic that's quite,
Sure.
frankly, being discussed these days here. Thank you. Go ahead.
You put your finger on, on the key issue here, the line of June 4th, 1967, right from the beginning. It was the policy of Hafiz al-Assad that in terms of territory recovered from Israel, he could settle for absolutely nothing less than what President Anwar Sadat got from Israel. Full withdrawal from all occupied territory. Now, in the case of Egypt and Israel, and I realize that there are some complications here. Ambassador Ramzi referred to one of them, but it essentially had to do with restoring a previous boundary. Okay, in Syria, the Syria-Israel case, it was a bit more complicated than that because of a demilitarized zone that had been created during the armistice negotiations in 1949. And as of June 1967, Syrian forces were still present in small portions of that zone. So defining the line of June 4th became for me a very important priority, because it was the lack of definition in the 1990s that really enabled this catastrophic summit at Geneva to take place, where a dying Hafiz al-Assad was told, in essence, by the United States, come to Geneva, we're going to put something on the table that is going to solve this issue of the line of June 4th to your full satisfaction. And the opposite happened. President Clinton ended up putting on the table a map essentially created by the Israeli prime minister that would have removed Syria from any form of proximity to Lake Tiberias. And Assad took one look at the map and essentially said, "Hey, if this is it, our business here is finished. Peace is not a possibility." By sheer coincidence, just before Shepherdstown began, a book I wrote trying to define the line of June 4th, 1967 as exactly as possible, not down to the meter by meter, but where in general terms this line ran, because we're not talking about a demarcated boundary. And there are differing views on where it actually runs, but my book came out that really gave the first definition of what this means, and I picked it up during my mediation. And again, what I found was both sides exhibited, to me, in any event, complete seriousness in trying to come up with a line that reflected as accurately as possible the separation of Israeli and Syrian forces in the Jordan Valley as of June 4th, 1967, before the war began. And I think we were making considerable progress. The Syrian side, to my surprise and pleasure, accepted the 10-meter line off the northeastern shore of Lake Tiberias. There was not going to be a fence built there. We would be able, I think, to reach arrangements that would enable Syrians to have recreational access to the Sea of Galilee. All of that, in my view, was doable. If I had any sense of optimism at all about where this process was going, it was on the territorial front, Nabil. I thought, the last remaining outstanding issue of any importance, the upper Jordan River. We're talking about differences of 10 or 15 meters. I mean, this was not beyond the ability of anyone to solve. In terms of the Lebanon-Israel maritime situation, you're quite right. This seems to be heating up again. In the middle of my Israel-Syria mediation, I was asked by our ambassador in Lebanon at the time to try to broker some kind of agreement between Israel and Lebanon on a maritime separation line that would define the respective exclusive economic zones of the two countries for the purpose of exploiting natural gas from the seabed of the Eastern Mediterranean. For the better part of a year, I was back and forth between Beirut and Jerusalem, listening very carefully to the conflicting claims of the two sides. I was not, at least at the beginning, I was not an expert on maritime law or maritime lines or any of that business. But one of the things I discovered is it is quite possible for two parties to project conflicting lines from land out into the sea, and in this case, lines that produced a disputed zone of approximately, I think, 860 square kilometers. They can produce conflicting lines fully in accordance with international law and fully acceptable cartographic practices. So after listening to the two parties and after briefing both sides about the apparent intent and methodology of the other in an effort to, tamp down conspiracy theories about what the other side was doing, I eventually got to the point where I felt confident I could offer a reasonable compromise. And what I said to the parties was, look, the United States has a lot of experience in this area. Up until the year 1900, the primary activity of American foreign policy, believe it or not, was trying to resolve maritime disputes with Canada. We have enormous experience in the Caribbean, drawing lines that are ultimately mutually agreed. So what I said to the parties was, all I can do to offer a reasonable compromise here is to use American methodology in projecting lines from land out into the sea. It is the simplest methodology out there. I can pretend that the United States is Lebanon and Israel is Mexico, or Israel is the United States and Lebanon is Canada, but I am going to project an American line from Ras Noura out to the Cypriot line, and I don't know where it's going to, what the division is going to be, but this is really all I can offer in good conscience. I cannot spend the rest of my life trying to mediate meter by meter a disputed zone in the Mediterranean Sea. So this is what we did. The so-called Hoff line, which is still out there, I guess, for consideration, and the result, as it happened, would have been a 55-45 division of the disputed zone in favor of Lebanon. And both sides, after expressing a great deal of outrage because each side thought it was entitled to 100%, both sides ultimately came to see this as a reasonable compromise. It was formally accepted by Israel. The Lebanese prime minister at the time, the current caretaker prime minister, Najib al-Mikati, thought it was a decent compromise and was trying to organize his cabinet to accept it. But then, in the autumn of 2012, there were some events in Lebanon. There was a high-profile assassination, and things began to deteriorate quickly. And Prime Minister Mahdi was never able to get his cabinet united on the issue of accepting the maritime separation line that we had proposed.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador. That's been very useful. I'm going to go back to Ramzi in a second, but I just wanted to remind those who have been on the chat, if you have questions, please send them in now so that I can take a look at them and then share them with Ambassador Hoff before the last round, because we're coming close to the hour that we set for this program. Ramzi?
Okay. Yes. Fred, I mean, clearly you have really spent a lot of effort on the June 4th line and on other issues, and to the point that you felt that early in 2011, a deal was doomed. My question to you is, you have solved all the technical issues clearly, but to be able to proceed to a closing of the deal, you needed to have an enabling political environment. And here I have some questions. I mean, first of all, it was obvious, and I think you acknowledge that the Syrian track was not a priority for the Obama administration. It was more the Palestinian track. Second, the Israelis made it very clear that they could not move on two tracks simultaneously, and certainly not reaching agreement on two tracks simultaneously. Given that the American administration was more focused on the Palestinian, I would assume that the Israelis also at least thought that this was the priority for them too. And third, the Syrians, as Nabil has pointed out, have been actually quite clear from the very beginning, and according to your book, have been flexible in the sense that they've said they wanted to go back to the June 4th line, but they were prepared to negotiate everything else without difficulty. Now, given these conditions, do you think there was an enabling political environment conducive to find an agreement? And what lessons would you draw from that? And how would you, I mean, if you were in a position now to redraw things and to change things, how would you do them different? Now, two specific questions I have for you. You referred to the Geneva Communique on Syria. According to what you have in the book, the issue of mutual consent, which is really the elephant in the room in the creating of the transitional governing body, the Americans and the Russians agreed on it, which they, of course, they did, but they had different interpretations. According to you, the Russians and the Americans had the same interpretation, which is mutual consent only for creating for the TGB. And then the Russians changed their position, basically said that it's on everything has to be agreed upon by Assad. Now, why would it take another year for the Security Council to endorse this communique? The Russians, I understand, wanted the Security Council to immediately endorse it. The Americans refused, and it was only possible for the Security Council to endorse it when they adopted Security Council Resolution 2118 on chemical weapons. So I hope you can just clarify this point, because it remains a very controversial one until this moment, although I think, the TGB is no longer uh, of the same importance it had when I started my mediation efforts in 2014. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramzi. I'll be very brief on the on the issue of timing and the Obama administration sense of priority with the Syria track. This basically forms my greatest sense of regret in the way in the way I undertook this mediation. I think in retrospect, I spent too much time trying to go down the traditional route of getting from the Israelis, from Bibi Netanyahu of all people, the deposit. I have a lingering feeling that if we had been at the same place we were in early March 2011, say 6 months earlier, it's quite possible that we would have been at the point where where both sides would have been able to acknowledge publicly that it appeared an agreement was at hand. Even then, I think it would have been difficult. Prime Minister Netanyahu indicated to me at one point that even with Knesset approval, there would be a referendum in Israel on this issue, and I don't know how that would have gone. Bashar al-Assad, for that matter, had public opinion to deal with, something that many in the West and certainly many in Israel think is not a factor at all. That with an authoritarian government, he could do anything he wanted. But Assad had to be sure that he could articulate to the people of Syria that this was an honorable agreement, that Syria was achieving its demands. The other sense of regret I have is that I think I assumed that the Obama administration was seriously committed to the idea of comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace, and that if there had been a slowdown on the Palestinian track, which clearly there was, my boss George Mitchell was having the devil's own time trying to get Netanyahu and President Abbas to cooperate and move toward an agreement. That there would be nothing wrong with moving full speed ahead on the Syria track. I think I discovered at the end, and it began to occur to me as I was sending reports back to the White House about my conversation with Bashar al-Assad and then my conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu, that there was no response at all. It struck me that the response was one of shocked silence, like what's going on here. So to this day, I have a question as to whether or not the administration was really committed to seeing Syria-Israel peace to its conclusion. It would have been very interesting indeed if President Assad had resorted to politics and diplomacy rather than the methodology he chose in dealing with peaceful protests in Syria. It would have been interesting to see how the Obama administration would have dealt with the prospect of evident progress on this Syria-Israel track. I would have been happy to take my chances to see how all that would have turned out. I think we had a real opportunity, and in the end, it's an opportunity lost. On the and finally on this on the mutual consent clause in the Geneva final communique. I was part of a senior member of the American negotiating team at Geneva, trying to support Kofi Annan's efforts to come up with an agreement. I recall very clearly my discussions with my Russian counterparts at the time. I have personally, I have no doubt that the United States and Russia were on the same page on the definition of mutual consent. And it was essentially, in negotiations between the opposition and the government to create a unity government of some kind. There would be a mutual veto. That the Russians saw this as a decent alternative to excluding Assad by name, or excluding people with, quote, blood on their hands, unquote, which the Russians saw as sort of a synonym for Bashar al-Assad. So I have no doubt this was clearly understood. I mentioned in the book, I was told sometime later that a Russian delegation had gone to Damascus to explain all of this to President Bashar al-Assad, and that Assad was outraged by what he was hearing from the Russians. That he was telling the Russians, in essence, you have agreed to regime change. So it's not at all surprising to me that the Russians would reconsider the meaning of mutual consent. And later on in 2012, after I was gone from U.S. government, there was a series of discussions between the Russians and our Deputy Secretary of State at the time, Bill Burns, on this.
Thank you. Let me jump in here with comments and a number of questions from the chat, from Najja Naqib and Sean David Hobbs in particular. Some of them quite cunning, frankly. Question to the Ambassador Hof: if negotiations were to start today between the Israelis and the Syrians, what would be the Israeli position? What would be their ask? That's one question. Let me just give them all to you, because we're running out of time, so I want to give you enough time. The other set of questions come about around the issue of Russia. Russia, of course, has a particular influence in Syria, and is that influence something that can be used to push this process forward? And a specific example given here in the questions was, for example, assuring delivering of Russian wheat. Would that be an incentive to the Syrian regime, besides, of course, what they get by way of support? But the add-on here really is, would the US object to this? And I'll sort of let you close with the answers to those questions.
Okay. On the question of negotiations, I think the prospects for any sort of resumed Israel-Syria peace negotiations are nil. Okay, but just for the sake of the question, let's just assume that somehow Israel and Assad, come to an agreement that they should negotiate. I think the specific question is, what would the Israeli ask be? I think the Israeli ask would probably be complete Syrian geostrategic, geopolitical reorientation, get rid of the Iranians, break relations with Hezbollah. Oh, and incidentally, now there will be no territorial component to these negotiations. I think for at least hypothetically, for Israel sometime in the future to consider a territorial component of some kind, whether it's the Jolan, the line of June 4th, one key requirement is that there would have to be a legitimate political system in Syria, a system with leaders who are actually capable of speaking for the Syrian people on matters of war and peace. That situation, certainly from an Israeli point of view, and I would say from an American point of view, does not exist right now. In terms of Russia pushing the process forward in Syria, and I assume the word process refers to some kind of political settlement. It's not for a lack of trying on the part of the United States and others that pleading with Russia to play a more creative and positive role has fallen short. My conclusion after all these years is that it is very much in the interests of the Russian Federation to persuade, to pressure Bashar al-Assad into sharing power, leaving power, somehow enabling governance in Syria that approaches legitimacy. All right, I believe this is in the interests of the Russian Federation. What is in the interests of President Vladimir Putin may be something entirely different. I believe it's something entirely different. I think Russia's success in propping up Bashar al-Assad over the years provides Putin with a major talking point for his domestic political audience. What Putin has been able to say, in essence, and all of this predates the atrocities of Ukraine and all of that. What Putin has been able to say is, look what we have done in Syria. We have rescued Bashar al-Assad, of all people, not the most impressive person in the world, but we have rescued Bashar al-Assad from Western regime change machinations. And this is exhibit A in my argument, Vladimir Putin's argument, that Russia is back as a great power in the world after decades of humiliation. I think it is the Putin position on Bashar al-Assad specifically that has prevented Russia from playing a positive role in Syria and has frustrated numerous statesmen over the years, whether they're United Nations, American, or whatever, in trying to seek some form of meaningful Russian cooperation in Syria.
Thank you, Ambassador. I was about to sort of follow up with an add-on here, but we're 10 minutes beyond the hour, and I do want to respect, well, let me actually go beyond that. The question really on the Russian issue was twofold. One, would Russia do it? Secondly, would America accept Russia to do it now in light of the tension between America and the US? So you mentioned that in the past there have been requests to do that. But if magically the Israelis and the Syrians decide to negotiate, and Russia definitely has influence in the Syrian domain, would America actually encourage them to play that role?
I don't, Nabil, I don't think the United States would hesitate to cooperate with Russia if it could see clearly that there is some kind of benefit for the Syrian people and for the stability of Syria. Clearly, notwithstanding what's happening in Ukraine, for example, there have to be discussions about reauthorizing the humanitarian corridor at El Bab from Turkey into Syria. This is going to mandate discussions between Americans and Russians at the official level, both at the United Nations and I suspect elsewhere.
Okay, I won't push it more than that. Ambassador Hoff, it's really been a pleasure hosting you this afternoon, evening, or morning, depending on where everybody is. Let me close again by saying this is a book that is really worth reading. And it is really a pleasure to be able to host the author and to bring the content of the book to the audience that follows the Tahrir dialogues. Ramzi, as always, you've been insightful, to the point, and have a great sense of choosing the right questions to put forward. This subject in particular, because of your experience in it, is it's clearly self-evident. Ladies and gentlemen, those of you in the audience, thank you all for being with us today. And I do hope that you'll join us again. I think our next dialogue will be on June 20th, and it will be on cyber security. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Nabil, thank you. Thank you, Ramzi.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Nabil.